We'll begin our presentation with this quote from the book. To put this presentation together, we conducted an interview with an art historian, read a book on the sources of Japanese tradition, and used the knowledge we've gained over the period of this course. For the most part, we'll discuss the background of Zen Buddhism in light detail, shining light on its role in popular culture, and bring you snippets of our interview with Jean Phillips to help you get a better grasp of what Zen Buddhism is viewed as from an art historian's perspective. The book, this quote, and as well as another quote by Dogen will be discussed in the interview. Today, Buddhism has three main branches: Shinto Buddhism, which is a syncretic religion, Mahayana Buddhism, and Zen Buddhism. Keep in mind these are just the most popular forms of Buddhism in Japan. Here are some numbers about Buddhism for you math lovers. 90 million people consider themselves Buddhist in Japan. Religion does not directly affect everyday life. Actually, only 17% of Zoto laymen go to Shinto shrines out of spiritual need, and funerals are usually carried out in the Buddhist way. Around 80% of Shinto Soto laymen attend funerals. Here's a little about Zen Buddhism background. There's emptiness and impermanence, which should sound familiar, and will of course come up later. The other terms are close related to Indian traces of Buddhism. This here is the influence on Zen Buddhism and other forms of Buddhism in Japan. In an attempt to sum it all up, Zen Buddhists practice meditation as a way to concentrate on what's within, thus practicing self-reliance and understanding. Meditative practices trace back to India during ancient times. Here, we may ask ourselves, then strictly differentiates Japanese Zen Buddhism. It is simply the way in which Soto Zen Buddhism, Dogen Zen school, Eisai was actually a founder of Rinzai Zen Buddhism sector in Japan. Likewise, his teaching differed considerably from Dogen's. The difference essentially is in the method of which obtains enlightenment. Here are some quotes to get you thinking about Zen Buddhism as our favorite master Dogen saw it. He really is an important name to recall whenever you hear the Japanese and Zen in the same sentence. The middle quote should remind you of a particular Zen piece of art, but if it doesn't, stay tuned for the discussion on Zen Buddhism and art. What might we interpret about Buddhism in the novel? Can we say that the lack of place to fit in, parental guidance, and our attempt to write to someone who may or may not exist, that now is like the lost character on a path of enlightenment, while Jiko provides now with Buddha-charged advice is like a Zen master who has already been enlightened? At times, the advice Jiko gives now may be reminiscent of a koan, but the point is that now never is enlightened. She doesn't go through an accidental occurrence or a sound or sight, impinging on the conscious of an individual, or else some deliberate act of master, a shout or a blow to the head intended to startle or awaken the minds of the disciple. And now may not obtain enlightenment about Buddha's principles, but with Jiko's final words to live, now has obtained enlightenment through her master's actions. Through Buddhist technique, much like Dogen obtained enlightenment through his encounter with Zen master Ju Qing, but now is not also like Dogen, for both felt a moment of hopelessness soon before attaining enlightenment. Here we would like to discuss Zen Buddhism as a popular part of Japanese culture, in terms of religion, but also as a ceremonial tea practice and art. For a few influences are listed here. And although Buddhist ideas, practices, and influences have origins outside Japan, it is still fair to look at Zen Buddhism as it applies to Japan. First major part of popular culture is samurai. This archetype of the stoic, badass, sword-wielding warrior can be seen in countless movies, animes, and other forms of media associated with Japanese culture. But here we look at how Zen Buddhism mixed into the ways of the samurai warrior as a form of disciplinary instruction and masculine aura when these warriors hit the battlefield. And although it was useful for aspects of violent nature, it was also still a significant practice for samurai during the peaceful Edo or Tokugawa period. It is said that Eisai's advocacy for the importance of drinking is a factor contributing to the rise of its popularity in Japan. This ceremony, which originated sometime in the 12th or 13th century when Eisai brought tea ceremony from China. It was redefined by Zen master Eisai. Today, tea is still a national beverage of Japan, where countless tea beverages have emerged. Outside of Japan, people try to imitate this aesthetic. But moving on to this context, what can we understand about Zen art after reading A Tale for the Time Being? From these images, we can easily see how Buddha nature exists within a number of objects, which Jiku constantly stressed. From the photograph on the far right, we can see the way in which garden may also pass for water, as it imitates the rippling action of water. But even so, it is still a garden, different from water, but still the same. And there is the impermanence of the mountain and the plants. These paintings aren't painted with great detail, or they're fading techniques used to represent how these things aren't continually changing. In order to possibly better grasp the aspects of Zen Buddhism in Japanese culture, we met to conduct an interview with Jean Phillips.
Okay, my name is Jean Phillips, and I teach the history of Japanese art, and that includes a course especially on medieval Japanese religion and art. And so I have to deal with sort of Zen Buddhism and its relationship to the arts, as well as other sorts of Buddhism and their relation to the arts quite a bit. Impermanence?
Yes.
Well, this is really not just a Zen Buddhist idea, it's a Buddhist idea in general. And the fact is that all of reality is temporary, or what we think of as reality is merely temporary. And in some forms of Buddhism, it doesn't exist at all. It is simply illusion. Ultimately, all distinctions between anything, self and other, life and death, nirvana and hell, all of those are illusions. Ultimately, there is, according to most schools of Buddhism that found their way to Japan and developed there, all of that is illusion. It's ultimately there is only the Buddha nature. You just have to find it within yourself.
And that's the goal, right?
In Zen, yes. Okay. Find it within yourself, and some other schools as well. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Dogen is terrifically difficult to understand. It's sort of like trying to understand Heidegger when he thought, in his being and time. But I think if you think again in this general idea, one way in this Buddhist worldview to see things is in our plane of existence, time exists because distinctions exist. You really can't have time as we understand it without distinctions. In other words, here to there, right? You move from here to there, it takes time. You grow from baby to adult, it takes time. But if ultimately there are no distinctions, there's only the Buddha nature, there is no time. But Dogen seems to be doing something a little bit different there, too, as far as I can understand it, which is saying that in fact, everything that every moment that has existed, still exists, always exists. In other words, the flow of time may be an illusion, but every moment in time has always existed, will always exist, because it's all, again, part of the ultimate nature that we might call Buddha. This idea that time really doesn't fly. It just is, like everything else just is.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, in the book, there's Ruth and Now who existed at different times, supposedly, because Ruth is reading about Now that before her. So I guess in sense of like, if you think about it like that, then they actually aren't separated because time It just exists. So there's no separation between Ruth's time and now's time, right?
I mean, that's certainly one way to look at it, especially from the vantage point of a novelist.
Right, okay.
Or a Buddha.
Okay.
You know, and as a historian, which as an art historian I am, students, for example, will read history books and there's a nice narrative and they feel like, oh, I understand the flow of time in this narrative. But in fact, when you actually look at how that narrative is constructed by us, by the historians, it's like this diary entry, it's this letter, it's kind of discrete things, and we only make it into history by transforming those discrete bits into a story. As an art historian, I don't really have much to say about it. As someone who studies religion and who has an interest in Zen Buddhism, there's sort of the Zen as sort of transforming the way you look at the world, and at the same time as sort of a self-help, becoming more accepting of your own state and so forth, and in some way finding peace within yourself, which is great. But as a historian, an art historian, or any kind of historian, to me, Zen Buddhism is an institution, as a religion that developed, that had constituencies and monks. In other words, Zen Buddhism on the ground, so to speak, the way it was actually practiced and lived, is a much more complicated situation. So some of the points that I tried to make was that if you look at what went on and what still goes on in actual Zen monasteries, they seem to have a very reverential attitude towards any number of beings, including their own spiritual ancestors, like the patriarchs of Zen, their teachers, their teachers, and so forth. And they actually, in the ceremonies they do on certain death anniversaries, they perform very sort of standard kinds of Buddhist rituals that seem to suggest that being has not gone on to emptiness,
right,
but is actually still out there somewhere as a discrete entity. In other words, it's not dissolved. And that's kind of against some of the basic ideas of Zen.
Right.
That if someone has been a Buddhist master, a Zen master, then after they die, they should be somewhere else and disconnected with this world. But if you look at what they actually do, they don't treat it that way. They don't treat that person who's passed on in the same way. And as I mentioned, the monks still take the Bodhisattva vows, which sort of acknowledges that the scope of Buddhism goes on and on beyond the individual's death, and that it's part of a greater scheme for the salvation or enlightenment of all living beings. And actually, Ruth Ozeki mentions that in relation to Nao's great-grandmother, in that she talks about the Bodhisattva vow.
Okay.
So it's an interesting thing.
Although we've tried to study Zen Buddhism as something that it goes under a lost list of things we consider Japanese, but is influenced by a culture outside Japan, the Chinese culture. We may not understand Ozeki's book to be a commentary on how Zen Buddhism is Chinese or Indian, with a Japanese way of appropriation, but after reading the book, we see Zen Buddhism as a unique in its practices and techniques to achieve enlightenment and concepts. But then again, is it really?